In this video, we will look at the centrifugal forces acting on the belt of a belt drive and their effect on power transmission. The basic relationships between belt forces and the torque to be transmitted, as well as the minimum belt tension required to transmit a given circumferential force, have already been explained in the linked video. As long as no circumferential force is transmitted, the only belt force acting in both belt sections is the preload force Fp. When a circumferential force is introduced into the belt by the torque of the driving pulley, the belt force in the tight side increases by half the circumferential force to the value Ft. At the same time, the belt force in the slack side decreases by half the circumferential force to the value Fs. As long as the belt speed is relatively low, these acting belt forces can be considered independent of the belt speed. However, at higher belt speeds, significant centrifugal forces act on the belt sections rotating around the pulley. These centrifugal forces pull the belt outward and try to lift it off the pulley. As a result, the contact force and thus the frictional force between the belt and the pulley decreases. In the case of high centrifugal forces, the frictional force may not be sufficient to transmit the required circumferential force. In this case, sliding slip occurs. To avoid this, the belt must be additionally tensioned by the amount of centrifugal force acting during operation. This is done by increasing the preload force by the amount of the later acting centrifugal forces. This additional belt tension is called the centrifugal belt force. So note, centrifugal forces are created as the belt rotates with the pulley. These centrifugal forces try to lift the belt off the pulley. This must be counteracted with an additional preload. Centrifugal forces occur only when the belt is moving in a circular path and therefore only in the areas where the belt wraps around the pulley. There, the centrifugal forces are directed radially outward. Although no centrifugal forces act on the straight sections of the belt force there is influenced by the centrifugal forces as they pull the belt outward, and this pulling effect causes an additional centrifugal belt force Fb. It is important to distinguish between centrifugal force and centrifugal belt force. In the following, centrifugal force refers to the radial centrifugal force in the rotating belt sections that tries to lift the belt off the pulley. Centrifugal belt force, on the other hand, refers to the force in the straight sections of the belt that results from the centrifugal forces and is ultimately in equilibrium with them. If the deflection of the belt on the slack side is neglected, the centrifugal forces are distributed symmetrically with respect to the center line of the two pulleys. Therefore, the resulting centrifugal force acts along this line. Due to the symmetrical distribution of the centrifugal forces, it is clear that they act equally on both belt sections. The belt force on the tight side is thus increased by the centrifugal forces to the same extent as the belt force on the slack side. So note, centrifugal forces increase the belt forces on both the tight and slack sides equally. The tight side force Ft and the slack side force Fs increase at high speeds by the amount of the centrifugal belt force Fb. However, the higher belt forces have no effect on the actual transmitted circumferential force Fc, as long as this force is less than the maximum transmittable circumferential force. This is evident when we determine the circumferential force from the difference between the two belt forces. We see that the centrifugal belt forces cancel each other out and are irrelevant to the transmitted circumferential force. The actual transmitted circumferential force is therefore independent of the centrifugal forces, as long as the circumferential force is less than the maximum transmittable circumferential force. Only this maximum transmittable circumferential force is reduced by centrifugal force. Therefore, it is important to ensure that the maximum transmittable circumferential force is sufficiently greater than the actual transmitted circumferential force, taking into account the effect of centrifugal force. So note, centrifugal forces have no direct effect on the actual transmitted circumferential force, as long as it is less than the maximum transmittable circumferential force. It should be noted that the terms tight side force and slack side force often refer only to the belt forces Ft and Fs that are relevant to the actual power transmission, which are the forces in the quasi-static state, neglecting centrifugal forces. Centrifugal forces are often listed separately for the aforementioned reason that they have no direct influence on the transmitted circumferential force, although both forces act together as a belt force and cannot be physically separated, as they always act as a resultant force. In the following, the centrifugal belt force Fb is to be determined for a given belt speed v. It should be noted again that the term centrifugal belt force Fb does not refer to the centrifugal force itself, but to the additional force acting in the belt due to the centrifugal forces. This is the force by which the belt must be additionally pre-tensioned in order to completely compensate for the centrifugal forces acting during subsequent operation, and thus be able to transmit the maximum possible circumferential force. In order to derive the centrifugal belt force, it is sufficient to consider the unloaded state, when the belt is rotating without transmitting any circumferential force, because according to the derived formula for the circumferential force, the centrifugal forces have no influence on the circumferential force, and vice versa, the circumferential force has no influence on the centrifugal forces. So if we simply consider an unloaded belt drive, the only force in the belt is the centrifugal belt force Fb. If the belt speed is constant, the centrifugal belt force must be the same at every point on the belt to maintain equilibrium, otherwise some section of the belt would accelerate. However, we assume a constant belt speed where elastic slip as the belt rotates around the pulleys can be neglected. Now we consider a section of the belt at an angle d phi that runs around the pulley. In this case, the centrifugal force dF acting on this section must be in equilibrium with the centrifugal belt forces Fb. Thus, the addition of the vectors geometrically forms a closed triangle. Using the definition of the radian measure as the quotient of the arc length and the arc radius, the specified relationship between the centrifugal force dF and the centrifugal belt force Fb can be established. The given formula, then, applies to the centrifugal belt force. The centrifugal force dF acting on the considered section of the belt with a mass dm can be calculated from the square of the belt speed v and the pulley radius r as shown. Using this term in the formula for the centrifugal belt force gives the formula shown. The mass dm of the considered belt section depends on the chosen angle d phi. The greater the angle, the greater the mass dm because the belt section is longer. Therefore, we first relate the total mass m of the belt to its total length L and obtain the indicated quantity m', also called specific weight. The mass dm of the belt section in question is therefore the product of the specific weight m' and the length dl of the belt section. Now we can establish a relationship between the length dl of the considered belt section and the pulley radius r, using the angle d phi in radian measure. Note that for simplicity, the radius of the circular path of the belt is equated to the radius of the pulley. Thus, the formula given applies to the length dl of the belt section. We now use this term for the length dl in the formula for the mass dm of the belt section and obtain the expression shown. We then use this expression in the formula for the centrifugal belt force Fb and obtain the formula shown. In this formula, we can cancel the radius r and the angle d phi, and finally we obtain the shown formula for determining the centrifugal belt force Fb at a given specific weight of the belt m' and a given belt speed v. As we can clearly see, the centrifugal belt force Fb does not depend on the pulley diameter or the wrap angle. Therefore, it does not matter whether we consider the centrifugal forces at the input pulley or the output pulley. To fully compensate for centrifugal forces during later operation, the belt must be pre-tensioned by an amount equal to the centrifugal belt force. In the video on power transmission, the necessary preload force to compensate for the centrifugal force was already discussed and the result is as shown. The term in brown indicates the additional preload required to compensate for the centrifugal forces that will occur later in operation.